Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're just admitting everyone to the webinar, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. Thank you again, everyone. We're going to be getting things underway in just a few seconds. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Winnipeg. Before we begin, in just a few moments, this event will be closed captioned. And once that begins, I should point out that to access captions, you will just press the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. For those of you watching on YouTube now or in the future, please note that I will have activated captions on my side as well. So we will have that going by the time the actual presenters are speaking, with many thanks. We are broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Beneath my feet tonight is the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are here tonight to celebrate the exceptional debut collection of short fiction, Personal Attention Roleplay by Helen Chau Bradley. Published by one of the most consistently impressive independent presses in the country, Metonymy Press, this book heralds the arrival of a very exciting authorial voice. In the words of the wonderful writer, Casey Plett, Helen Chau Bradley's writing is shimmering, beautiful, and funny. There's no question they're a new writer to watch. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to the Winnipeg Public Library for helping to promote this event, as well as our colleagues in McNally Robinson Booksellers, Saskatoon. Just a few quick procedural notes before we get going tonight. There is a live chat, as you'll notice, so please do feel free to chime in and add pleasant commentary on that side. At the end of the evening, I will send the chat transcript to all of tonight's participants to ensure that they can read over all the wonderful things that you have to say. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions over the course of the evening. So as questions occur to you, please do feel free to place those in the Q&A box. You'll find that Q&A box just at the very bottom of the screen. That allows us to keep all the questions in one place, so your host for the evening can easily access them and ensure that everybody can hear them. There'll be a reading from tonight's featured author, followed by a conversation, and then we'll be closing down the evening. I should note that copies of all of tonight's books are available from McNally Robinson Booksellers, either in person, over the phone, or online. I'll put information on that in our into the chat in just a few moments. And just be one quick second. We now have captioning in the event as well. So thank you all so very much for your patience. All right, now we're going to get going, and I'll introduce tonight's participants. We have a really incredible crew of people here tonight, so I won't take up too much more of your time. Your host for the evening is Anna Leventhal. Anna is the author of the short story collection Sweet Affliction, which is published by Invisible Publishing. She's an MFA candidate at the UBC School of Creative Writing and teaches English at the University of Winnipeg. Leventhal is the 2021-22 Writer in Residence at the Winnipeg Public Library, having returned to Treaty 1 territory after 20 odd years in Jojage, Montreal. Jenny Heijun is the author of Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related, an incredible memoir that's already received an incredible amount of acclaim. It's published by McClelland and Stewart, and she's an incredible friend of the store as well. She's professor of English at the University of Winnipeg, where she is also the 2020 to 2023 Chancellor's Research Chair and director of the Critical Race Network. She is currently writing 2 novels, both of which sound completely fascinating, and we cannot wait to read them. And now, our guest of honor this evening is Helen Chau Bradley, a writer and musician living in Jojage, Montreal. They are the fiction editor for this magazine and the host of Strange Futures, a speculative fiction book club. Personal Attention is their first and exceptional book. Please join me in virtually welcoming Helen Chau Bradley.
Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to be doing this event with everyone. I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the last story. So this is my book, Personal Attention Roleplay, and I'll be reading an excerpt from the last story in the collection, which is called Soft Shoulder. I'm going to start sort of partway through. It's a fairly long story. All you need to know is that it's about a 3-person queer band who are on tour in the northeastern US, and they've brought a tour manager along who also happens to be dating one of the band members, and the other 2 band members have some strong feelings about that. Okay. Northampton. Northampton was the low-stakes warm-up date, a college town in western Massachusetts. The venue was a community hall with high ceilings and a low stage. As we spilled out of the van, groaning and stretching our limbs, the early evening air met us, wet and thick. We licked the sweat off of our upper lips and started hauling gear inside, clicking into action, our bodies remembering the routine. The hall smelled of warm wood and paint and patchouli incense. The sound was bad, but the feminist collective putting on the show were sweet, even though we were 2 hours late. We ate carrots and hummus and salami from our cooler while Logan set up the merch table, and we got on stage when the time came. The crowd was sizable, although quiet and shy. "Oh my God, we love Hecate!" Two young queers with matching rat tails and septum piercings sidled up to us as we were plugging in. "We are so excited you're playing tonight. We're going to buy shirts." Cute, we thought. Magda powered on her vocal delay and told everyone in deep, summoning tones to move on up. "Don't be afraid. We're a bunch of freaks from beyond, but we won't hurt you." We locked gazes for a second, as we always did, and dove in. The set was fine in the way that the first set of tour often is. Not a mess, not a miracle. We had to stop a couple of times when the microphone feedback got so shrill that people in the audience were cradling their ears and wincing. Not bad, we said to each other as we packed up. Our new songs seemed to hit well, sprinkled through the set like small peaks for us to climb. The cute matching queers plied us with compliments while trying on band tees. "Some of us are going to hang out after the show. Would you all maybe like to come?" They seemed nervous, visibly trembling as they stuffed the merch into their bike bags. We couldn't remember ever having been so gentle, so transparent. We smiled our least intimidating smiles and told them that we had to leave early the next morning, but thank you. Someone was already setting up after us to read some confessional poetry, and we escaped to sit and smoke on the steps. First show done. Logan was supposed to preside over our merch until we left. "Don't forget, the votive candles are free if they buy one of the less popular long sleeves," Sarita had reminded him over her shoulder. We crouched with our heads together, poking fun at the earnest poets, teasing each other about our little fuck-ups, a slipped chord here, an awkward fill there. We reminisced about our last tour 2 years ago, when we had driven through the first blush of New England fall, a string of college bars and warehouses, laughable payouts, bedrolls on basement floors, an endless group hangover, one of us vomiting memorably onto the soundboard one particularly bleary and disappointing evening. We did not allude to the incident, since Magda hated talking about it, especially when other people might overhear. "We were a total mess," one of us exclaimed, "a true triple threat. Remember that night that—" "Why do the three of you always have to leave me out of your conversations?" Logan was standing over us, his light hair fluffed from the heat, a petulant plumpness to his bottom lip. He seemed to have shed his earlier doziness. There was something alert and watchful in his face and posture. He moved to stand behind Taylor, placing his legs on either side of her body. "We were just remembering the last tour." Taylor looked up, wide-eyed. Sarita shook her head in annoyance. "We're not leaving you out, Logan," she said. "Don't be a baby. It's band stuff. Let us have our time together after we play, yeah?" Logan snorted loudly. "Don't call me a baby, though," he said. He pulled an envelope out of his shirt pocket. "I have your payout, so you'd better not be rude to me," he sing-songed. We narrowed our eyes at him. "Babe," Taylor said, looking from us to Logan and back again. She had fretted before tour about what she would do if tensions arose, and now that it was happening, her only instinct was to placate. "Whatever," Logan said. He twirled the envelope dramatically and stuck it back in his pocket. "Give it here," said Sarita, reaching her arm out. "Did you count it?" But he made a face at us and stalked off down the street. "What about the merch table?" Magda called after him. "What the hell was that all about?" Sarita said. "Is he going to be like this all tour?" Taylor attempted a laugh. "Guys, I'm sorry, I don't know what's got it into him. I think he's just sensitive to group dynamics sometimes." We all shared a look. "Sounds tough," Sarita said finally, "but let's hope this isn't Man Baby Tour 2019. We sat there a while longer, tried to get our mood back up by reciting pretend confessional poetry, but the energy had shifted. Eventually, we went back inside and started collecting our gear to drive it to the collective's house where we were crashing for the night. At some point, Logan reappeared, all smiles, as if nothing had happened. He'd bought an armful of snacks for us, which we accepted, shrugging. He kissed Taylor on the cheek and bent to pick up her base cab. Taylor waggled her eyebrows at us and nodded, like, "See, it's cool." The humidity from earlier had settled into chilly damp now that it was well past sundown. New York. The show in Hartford had been full of polo-shirted white college boys who trickled out over the course of our set, which clashed abruptly with the straightforward indie rock delivered by the two openers. They started off by shuffling nervously backwards anytime Magda leaned forward, screaming into her mic. "Bro, what the fuck are these chicks?" we heard one of them shout while we paused for Taylor to tune. He play-punched the guy beside him. "Get a load of the drummer, is that even a We're your worst nightmare, bro." Magda's cackle reverberated around the bar. "You make it through a whole show, you turn gay. It's a known fact." After that, Albany had been empty, and we played on autopilot while the bar staff and other bands stood around with their hands in their pockets. So we were excited to play New York, even though the city was always a gamble. Brooklyn was lousy with shows that were always happening at the same time as ours. We had never filled a venue there. The other bands, who we knew from previous tours, were hanging out on the curb as Sarita parked the van expertly, sweating and cursing out the traffic. We grinned out at the familiar throng, a forest of black cutoffs and tattooed limbs, every t-shirt advertising a band we loved. Layla from Hard Pass was even wearing one of our old shirts, white with 3 intertwined figures and angular purple text, which she'd cut into a sleeveless crop top. There was an open fire hydrant nearby. People were taking turns running through the spray, shaking off the heat. A dripping collection of punks and neighborhood kids, all whooping and jumping, cheered as we piled out. Hugs all around. We introduced Logan, who shook hands with everyone. "Our new manager," we said, smirking a little, an attempt to convey that we knew what our friends were thinking. "Fancy, fancy," Layla teased us, shaking the water out of her short curly hair, "moving up in the world." The show was packed. The other bands had pulled through on promo, but also apparently a lot of people had heard about our last record. By the time we went on, the venue was a miasma of beer and sweat. We felt the rush of finally being in our element. Loud, hot, fast oblivion. The bodies were dense enough that Magda threw down her guitar and risked a stage dive, got passed around the room, bobbing up and down in the swamp of palms until she was delivered, flushed and ecstatic and glorious, back to us. This was it, we thought. Tour had really begun. Afterwards, we all crowded around a couple of beer-slicked tables in the back. Taylor sat on Logan's lap. Vincent and Carlos from Geffen were arm wrestling sloppily, their elbows sliding around, knocking into everyone's drinks. Layla was working the bar, generous with the pours, waving our bills back into our wallets. Everyone was praising everyone else, passing a joint around. We were feeling loose and easy, even though the booker and the label rep that Logan had supposedly talked into coming had both left before the end of our set, if they had been there at all. "Fuck them," cried Magda, half laughing, half serious. "This whole lineup was sick and they can't be bothered. Where do you find these guys, Logan? They're lost." Everyone was laughing and the moment would have passed, except that Logan's face tightened, as did his grip around Taylor's waist. She shifted uncomfortably. "Let go," she said quietly. He rolled his eyes at her. We all saw it, but removed his arm, draping it over the back of his chair instead. We tried to catch Taylor's eye, but she evaded us, her gaze fixed on a stack of stools in a dark corner of the room. We hoped she'd move onto her chair, but she didn't. "Yeah, Logan." Sarita tapped her long nails along the side of her beer bottle. We could tell she was drunk, even if it wasn't obvious to the others. There was a certain tilt to her voice, a meanness. "What gives? None of your so-called connections are coming through so far? What did you do, alienate everyone before fleeing the country?" "What the fuck do you know?" Logan said, color flaring up his throat. "Easy there, bud," said Vincent. Everyone kept drinking and smoking, but there was some shuffling of feet, some scraping of chair legs. "Look," Logan had his arm around Taylor's waist again. "I wasn't the problem, okay? Back where I was living in Boston, there were a ton of weird dynamics in the scene, a lot of manipulative bullshit, and I tried to keep out of it, but it was basically impossible. A lot of twisted stuff happened. Taylor knows. I've told her all this, right, baby?" "Yeah, sort of." She was still staring at the stools. "I just feel really unwelcome and judged in a lot of queer spaces." Logan looked at each of us imploringly. We met his gaze briefly, gave him tight smiles. He sighed and made a face. It can be, I hate to say it, but triggering for me. Triggering, really? Layla was clearing some of the bottles away. I mean, I don't want to co-opt anyone else's lived experience, but yeah, triggering. I don't really feel comfortable talking about it, actually. Dude, laughed Carlos, you're the one who brought it up. We suddenly felt how empty the venue was with the crowd gone. As if on cue, the other bands started pushing their chairs back, saying it was probably time to load out, and great playing with you, and have a good drive tomorrow. We got up as well and carried our gear to the van in the muggy silence. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yay!
Hi.
Thanks so much for that reading, Helen. Hi, welcome to the Prairies. This is the
Yay.
official Prairie launch of Personal Attention Roleplay. So, I thought I would make my background appropriate.
It's perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to remind anyone watching at home that you can ask questions for Helen or for Jenny, or heck, you can ask questions for me in the Q&A box below. And of course, feel free to use the chat as well to say hey and show your appreciation for Helen and their incredible book. So yeah, Helen, again, congratulations so much on this book. It's witty, it's adventurous, it's tender, it's groundbreaking. I could keep saying adjectives, but I would love to actually ask you some questions about it. So the story that you just read, it uses an unusual narrative device. It's told from a collective we point of view. So the three band members do speak individually, but the narrative is told with their collective voice. And I thought that was a really interesting choice. And I would love to hear more about why you chose this perspective.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, it's one of the later stories that I wrote for the collection. And, most of the stories in the book are concerned with like naughtiness, like KNO, and tension in interpersonal relationships. And I sort of noticed that I tended to focus on like two-person relationships a lot of the time. And I wondered what would happen if I challenged myself to write about a relationship between more than two people. And having been in a three-person band for many years, I started to think about like the kind of like intimacy that can happen in a small group of people who are, like consistently making art together. And I thought that that would be an interesting way to explore, intimacy in a more than two-person situation. And then, I think I take a lot of inspiration from people I read. So I had read a couple of different stories by other writers who had used the we as a narrative voice. And I thought one was a story by Alice Sola Kim, and then another is a story by Mariana Enriquez. And they both happen to be about kind of like complicated, like bad girl characters. And I wanted to see whether I could make that work for this particular story about this band. And yeah, it was very challenging. I think it's like the story that took the most work to sort of fit together, but I feel pretty happy with the sort of weird collective beast that it became.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely like a three-headed, six-armed kind of creature. Yeah, it's really cool. So one thing that this collection does so well is that it really nails queer culture, or at least a particular angle of queer culture that will be very recognizable to some people. The lingo, the outfits, the tensions, the dynamics, the rat tails. So how did you approach writing queer life? Did you have any inspirations? Did you keep a notebook and write down things your friends said for a couple of years?
No.
You don't have to reveal that.
No, certainly not. I don't know if I like felt that I was approaching it. I think that I am a queer person and I hang out with a lot of other queer people, and have been part of like various, queer spaces and collectives and, bands and scenes and organizations and whatnot. So it's really just like the air that I live in. I think it would be quite difficult for me to write any kind of fiction that did not come off as queer. I think that would actually probably take a lot more like intentionality.
Right.
And so I don't know that I had obviously like I've read certain writers who have accomplished that as well, like Gail Scott and like Zoe Whittle. I'm thinking of people who write about like queerness in a Montreal scenario, but yeah, I think when I had to go out and like search for different techniques in writing and stuff, it wasn't like the queerness was not what I needed,
right?
Sort of literary help with.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah. I just feel like your attention to detail is just so specific and just brings out these particular elements that it's like, oh yeah, I know that. So that was really well done. So just to go back more specifically to the section that you just read. It chronicles the beginning of a tour for a queer feminist punk band, but we also meet the band's dynamic, or we encounter the band's dynamic with their manager, Logan. And so it's, just to give a little bit of background, like at the beginning of the story, Logan is kind of a self-styled good guy who kind of ticks all the boxes and says all the right things about accountability and like not taking up too much space. But in this section, space is clearly taken. And we start to see Logan's character shift significantly from here on in. Why did you want to write about this particular dynamic?
I mean, obviously, like this story didn't happen to me. I was in a queer band and we did do these DIY tours, and none of us had boyfriends to bring along as tour managers. But but you know, I think like being like a band of 3 like women / like women adjacent people is still like a bit unusual. And I think that we definitely encountered like various scenarios where it felt like men who spoke about themselves publicly as being very like supportive of like women and queers and in music, like ended up being like quite shitty on various levels, you know, behind the scenes. And some people would know about it, other people wouldn't know about it. And it happens, as we know, like in many different artistic communities. And I wanted to play with that tension and sort of try to write a story about people who were like experiencing that in a very direct way. And it was also also just like a technique to sort of divide the 3-person we into a more fragmented group of people, because the presence of this guy starts to really drive a wedge between them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I was also just thinking about, like, not to spoil the story, but I was, you know, thinking about like how smaller communities, especially communities who like rightly like don't believe in the cops and like don't want prisons to exist, like how they deal with like situations where there is a sense that justice needs to happen, or that, you know, there have to be consequences for people's actions, and how that often like sadly gets very, very messy. And I've seen that happen, as we all have, like many times. And I wanted to try to write a story that tried to contend with that in some way, which is not to say that I condone the way it ends, but
yeah, I don't want to give that away either, but it does come to a pretty a pretty interesting conclusion. And that's, you know, just a little bit of a teaser. Definitely everyone should get this book. So Jenny, I'd love to bring you into the conversation now and kind of address a question to both of you a little bit. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome, Jenny. And again, just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And also live captioning is available by pressing the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom. So Jenny and Helen, one thing I think both your books do really beautifully is to complicate ideas about kinship. So Jenny, you explore how finding your Korean family of origin didn't really provide you with any easy answers about your identity. And Helen, in your case, many of your characters struggle with intimacy, both in familial relationships and within the sort of chosen family of their queer community and relationships. So I would love it if each of you could talk a little bit about kinship and why you wanted to explore it in your writing. And either of you can jump in.
Jenny, do you want to go first, since you haven't gone?
Give Helen a little break.
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's fair. No, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for including me in this. I feel like cooler by approximation somehow, but I realize that's not how this works. And I've just revealed myself by saying that, but thank you so much. I think at its core, and thank you for this question, Anna, my text is about kinship, but also like narratives of kinship and the dangerous or worrisome ways that kinship can sort of take over someone's mind. And in these different iterations, whether it's adoptive kinship, biological kinship, chosen kinship, etc. And I think I wanted to tell a story that revealed what happens when hopes are blighted around those kinds of kinships and how one can manage their sort of thwarted expectations outside of that, because kinship is it's a dangerous way that we organize ourselves at times, and it's a way based on belonging and perceived loyalty and all of these risky things. And so for me, it allowed me to think about things like vulnerability and boundaries and belonging and storytelling, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because what you do is that you do really kind of it's a counter narrative to the sort of the classic narrative that we often hear about kinship, that it's, it makes everything easier, it helps you understand yourself. And I really admire how your memoir, older sister not necessarily related, which I'm holding up right now, you can see. I really admire how it complicates and challenges those narratives. So thank you for that. And Helen, yes. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I like that you've drawn this comparison between the book. I just read Jenny's book and really, really loved it. And yeah, I hadn't really thought about that similarity between our writings, but it's true. Yeah, I think I've been trying to write about, I don't know, I guess I just think of how when I first became queer, I had this idea that oh, now I get to stop having these bad relationships with men, and I'm gonna be a lesbian. And it's, there is sort of that narrative of oh, just once you start dating a queer person, all of those relational issues of intimacy and trust and whatever will be gone, because you'll just automatically understand each other. And unfortunately, I, like many other people, have had to live to find out that that's not true at all, on really most levels. And there is I think you used the word blighted hope or something, Jenny, but it is that feeling I finally got this thing that I was told was going to solve a lot of problems for me, and in the end it's just as messy and complicated and painful as everything else.
But it makes for great fiction.
That's right. It's harder to write a happy story.
Yeah, we love the messy and complicated in the fictional world.
Totally.
So there's a short quote that I wanted to share from Jenny's book that I think really reflects nicely on some of what you're exploring as well. And so this comes from after the narrator, who's 8 years old in the section of Jenny's book, is asked where she's from. And Jenny writes, "I had to learn that being visible isn't the same thing as being seen, really being seen." And to me, these lines, honestly, they feel like they could be an epigraph for Helen's book. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of visibility and how both of you explore it in your work.
I love that, because the epigraph for my book is also, maybe not surprisingly, a little section about being seen and reflection. It's from a Yoko Tawada book.
Yes, you do have already a lovely epigraph.
Oh no,
not taking away from your epigraph.
I'm just saying, you're right on the money. Anyway, sorry, what was the question?
Just some reflections on visibility in the book, because your characters by and large are queer Asian young people, and they're sort of struggling to see themselves reflected in the world, but they're often, they find themselves objectified or fetishized. So I'd love to hear more about that kind of approach to visibility.
I think that, oh, am I okay? It says my connection's unstable. I wanted to write stories in which the characters are largely, you know, usually like Asian and queer, but I didn't want the stories to necessarily be about that. So I often try to give like narrative cues or dialogue cues or just little clues about, you know, the person who I'm writing about or the people I'm writing about and how like they move through the world and how other people react to them without being very didactic about like identity, because that's something, a bit of a thing that I try to avoid overly much. And I guess I tend to draw little details from like things that have happened to me. Like there's like a scene in one of the stories where like this random man approaches the main character and is like, I'm your neighbor. I've been watching you from across the street and you're so exotic and beautiful. And where are you from? And can we hang out? And like this used to happen to me all the time. But yeah, I think I don't want to write stories where anybody reading it can just like make that assumption that like the characters are like white and straight and whatever. I want people to think a little bit about like who the characters are and how they appear or are perceived by others. But yeah, I try not to make it the focal point of the narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenny, do you want to add anything about?
You know, this is one of the things that I love about your writing so much, Helen, that it feels like, you know, so I'm going to be teaching this workshop like later on next month or whatever. And the title of the workshop is Writing for Readers of Color. And one of the things that that I bring your book into that seminar thinking about is the way that there's sort of like language that happens that like, you know, a general reading audience can maybe pick up on some things here or there, but what you call clues, I feel are these sort of gifts of recognition and like communications that can happen between a reader. And it's interesting to hear you say, you know, I don't want to be overt, I'm trying to be subtle, but when I'm reading this, it's just like, well, obviously, like, hello. And so it feels like that thing that I was talking about earlier about like belonging and community and a different kind of connection. It feels like that's happening in this effortless way in your writing that makes one feel held by the text, but not like gripped onto or like not smothered, I guess. I don't mean to be so volatile in my language, but that's this astounding trick that you do. And earlier when I said like the blighted hope, I should cite the writer Chang Rei Li, who uses that phrase in one of his early texts.
Course,
and he also writes like this, though, with this kind of like this gestured communication to the one audience, but then it's still, you know, recognizable and appreciable by a broader audience. So it feels like a homecoming kind of.
Thank you.
So it's really lovely. And I would die if anything that I wrote was like the epigraph to anything that you wrote, because I always want to be your opening act, basically. Yeah, so I just love this idea of being visible and having some things surveyed, but then the things that are said like beneath the level of text are just like in the margins or where it's at, I think.
Oh, cool. Yeah, you put that so well. Yeah, like not wanting to overly explain anything, like you say, or like Anna, how you're saying like all these queer things are so like you're like, obviously this is like a queer punk house because I recognize the stairwell or whatever. But I want people who have not been in the queer punk house to be able to still read and enjoy the story, but the people who have will, hopefully appreciate it on like a different level, I guess.
So Helen, you do something in this book that I would be and am still terrified to do, which is to write a pandemic story during a pandemic. So I would love to know first how it feels to look back on that story now. And second, and this question can go to Jenny as well, how do you think the pandemic is going to change how and what we write?
Yeah, I mean, I was a little nervous about including that story in the book. I think there's like all these very like almost like polarized discussions online all the time about like no one should be writing about the pandemic ever. And like I do see that a lot, and I understand where that's coming from. I wouldn't have wanted to write an entire collection of stories in the pandemic. But I think that, I don't know, for me, I tend to write things that occur in like environments and atmospheres that I'm in or that I have been in, and like whatever, this was like a very first wave feeling story. The whole story takes place in a line. And it's just a bunch of unattributed dialogue by a lot of different people waiting in this line for a bunch of goods that may or may not appear. And actually, like it was like it sort of originated as a bit of a craft exercise. There was an entire novel by the Russian writer Vladimir Sorokin called The Queue. So I stole the title from him. And it's an entire novel, like maybe 250 pages of like all unattributed dialogue in this like Soviet bread line that becomes very surreal, and the line goes on for days and days, and people meet each other, people go off and have sex, people fall in love, they break up, like all within this, government ordered line. And I just wanted to see if I could make a story like that, and it made a lot of sense to set it in an early like pandemic distance line. And it was an opportunity to like have characters discuss, various questions and concerns and like rages that were and still are like being discussed all the time, like online and in person. But I don't know. I sometimes look at that story and I'm like, oh God, that's so embarrassing that I put this very obvious like first wave pandemic story in here. And other times I don't mind. And when I come across it, like anyway, not to call anyone out, but I was reading Casey's book recently, which I love. And she does have one story where like the pandemic is mentioned, and she's just sort of, the characters like talking about how like the isolation of the pandemic has like affected her. And I was like, I like this story. It doesn't bother me or like make me bored or angry that it takes place in the pandemic. So
yeah, I'll say that like personally, I think for the first year, I was one of those people who was like, absolutely not. I do not want to read anything pandemic related. I am not going to process my own feelings till 2045. I don't understand how other people can. But after about a year, I'm hungry for those stories now. I want to read them.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm also kind of wondering, like, in terms of, not to get too pretentious, but like the future of writing, I'm wondering, how am I going to incorporate the pandemic into my own writing? Like, am I just going to set everything in 2019 or earlier? Because like I tend to write contemporary fiction, so I don't really know what to do. That's not really a question, but if you have anything to add.
Jenny, you're writing some fiction right now. Are you having to contend with that?
Yeah, and so I guess this is the dilemma. If like pandemic isn't going to be narratively or thematically a part of the text, how does one navigate the stories that maybe were dreamed up before this moment? So I'm co-writing a text right now that's set in a sort of nondescript contemporary moment. But it's like, okay, well, they need to fly all over the world for this plot to continue as it is, and not be quarantining for 2 weeks afterwards. So like, do we say that they had iPhone 7s? Like, is that how we indicate
Totally.
like what the time setting is here? So it's about doing sort of like historical fiction research for like 3 years ago, like, you know, who was the CEO of this then, and like how can we contextualize this accurately? But it's because it's like avoiding the pandemic as like a narrative piece. I don't know.
Yeah, someone on Twitter made a comment today that kind of stuck with me about how, like, you know, at a certain point, we don't want to include the pandemic, or I speaking for myself only, you know, because I'm not sure, it just doesn't seem relevant to the story. But then after a certain point, it was like, this is just denial. Like, I'm just living in denial right now. Like, I'm gonna have to contend with it in my writing if I'm actually trying to write accurately about how we live. So that's something that's on my mind. So I feel like people in the audience are maybe feeling a little bit shy to put questions in the chat. So I just want to encourage you once again, we do have to wind down in not too long. I feel like I could talk to you two forever. Just to go back to the sort of, like we talked about, Helen, your story told entirely in dialogue, and many of your stories are actually quite stylistically adventurous. There's the collective narrative voice. There's also many elements of speculative fiction or surreal fiction. And Jenny, you also don't take a conventional approach to narrative in your book. So a little question for both of you. Is this kind of formal playfulness in writing, is it something that comes naturally to you, or is it something that you've worked at?
I'm dying to know the answer.
I was gonna let you go first. Okay, but all right. Yeah, go ahead. No. I want to know. Nope. Okay, I guess like one of the fun things about writing, well, Anna, you would know this too, as a published short story collection writer, with short stories is that they're short. So on the one hand, I feel like it's a lot of work to write a short story collection, especially if you're concerned with like I was very concerned with wanting all of my stories to feel quite, you know, different from each other. And I don't have like recurring characters or anything, and they're kind of set in all different places, and people are different ages and stuff like that. So part of me was like, man, this is really exhausting. Like I have to come up with a whole world and a whole bunch of like interior worlds for all these characters, like every single time I write a story, and there's 10 of them, which is kind of a lot. On the other hand, it means that I got to play around with a lot of different things. And I found that that was like a motivating thing for me. Like, I think if I had to sit down and write a collection and all the stories had to sort of be exactly the same vibe, if you will, I think I might have gotten a bit bored or like a bit uninspired. And so, you know, often the way that I stick myself is like,
oh, Helen, I'm losing your voice a little bit.
Sorry,
I think maybe your
hand.
Oh, better.
Are we good? Yeah. It was perfect. My hand. Yeah, the way I would try to like unstick myself often would be to be like, oh, I just read this book, or I read this story and I really love this narrative form that this person's using, and maybe I'll just see if I can do it. And more often than not, that would like unstick me, and then I would be able to do something with it. And that's definitely what happened with the Q, and also what happened with the collective narrative in Soft Shoulder. Nice. And a few other ones as well. Yeah.
What about you, Jenny?
I'm definitely not as courageous nor as brilliant like a craftsperson as Helen is. But I will say I feel that like my editor like reined me in a lot. And so what appears now is like a very conservative version of what was originally presented, which made it impossible to sell in the US. And so, which is something that was interesting to me to learn that there is different opportunity, let's just say, I'll just say like in life writing, because I'm not sure about fiction myself, sorry. There seemed to be more comfort with even a little bit of different approaches to storytelling. But it was kind of a mess what I originally submitted, and I did need the help for long form life writing, I guess,
Right.
to organize things a lot more and to stop being so nonlinear.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things I love about this book, though, is the nonlinear fragmented approach. I think it's really beautiful. So we do have some questions in the chat now. Sorry to jump around a little bit, but I want to make sure that I get to ask you these questions. So we have a question for Helen from Derek. Are there any challenges or delights along the writing publishing journey that have stood out for you so far? And a side question, maybe also compared to your music practice. Thank you, Derek, for that question.
Thanks, Derek. It's a bit of a funny question to answer because, you know, this is my first book and it was published in November, well into the pandemic. I think something that I was really looking forward to with publishing, and you asked the question about the music, like, was touring. Like, I really like to tour. I really like to meet people that way. You know, I'm like sad that like the three of us can't hang out in person, you know, like, and like I've made friends through touring, like, and I like to perform live. I think there's something about like audience energy that I find very like helpful, I think. Even just in terms of knowing like how people are reacting to certain stories, and in the band, like we, you know, would notice how people reacted to like certain songs, especially if they're new. And yeah, I love sort of the risk and the surprise of live performance, even though it can be very nerve-wracking. So I do miss not being able to do that, even though I'm still really grateful that we can do this. And otherwise, yeah, I mean, I think that what has been a delight so far with publishing this book is just that when this simple thing where like people write to me, either people I know or like old friends or people I've never met who are reading it, and they just write to me to tell me that they're connecting to it in some way. And that's like very like surreal and special. And I'm very honored like anytime that somebody tells me that they're reading my work, because they're taking the time to do that. That's really cool. And I do write for myself, but I you know, I write because I want to share the writing with other people. So that's like just
absolutely
very
and
motivating.
I'm glad that you're getting some of that feedback. That's really nice.
Thank
to
you.
hear. There's another question from Eli, which is for both of you. I'm curious about how you both go about writing difficult topics and leaving questions open or not wrapping up endings in a bow, whether it's in fiction or memoir, because I think you both do this beautifully in your respective genres.
Jenny, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Eli, brilliant author of Not Body. And thank you also, Derek Mascarenas, for the last question, brilliant author of Coconut Dreams. You know, thank you. It's really a thoughtful question. I think my answer is short and not very well thought out, but when it comes to issues of transnational and transracial adoption, I was just afraid to come out with an answer and a conclusion. To be honest, white adoptive parents like scare the pants off of me. And I was just, I didn't know, I didn't want to come out with like an ethical conclusion, I guess. And so I left things open, I think, as a way to suggest like the ambiguity of decisions and the paradox and complexity of decisions. So sorry, it's not a very thoughtful answer.
No, it's real.
But, you know.
Oh yeah, I really admire that about your book, Jenny, like all the way through, but yeah. And for me, I mean, I think that I guess I try to write, especially endings with ambiguity as much as possible. There's a temptation, I think, especially in a short story, to be like, you're gonna stick the landing and like everything's gonna be clear and everybody's gonna be satisfied But what I've learned is that I think that feeling of satisfaction might be quite fleeting, and it maybe is a little better to feel a bit like or quite like disturbed and maybe a bit uncomfortable and dissatisfied, not in a bad way, but like you don't want to be totally satisfied at the end of a story, I think, for the most part, or I don't want to be. So I think I write stories that are not really going to give you that feeling of like closure.
You want people thinking about it after.
Yeah, in the band we used to say like we would like perform a set for a certain amount of time, and then we'd always be like, should we add another song? They'd be like, no, leave them wanting more. So I guess I've tried to bring that into my writing practice.
So I have one more. Oh, there's another question here. So I think we'll probably have to wrap up after these two questions, but I will ask them. So Amy, and I feel like our guest list here is really stacked with great writers today. So Amy asks, Helen, did you laugh as you were writing some parts of your stories? I found some parts so funny, especially the many interactions between characters.
I laughed all the way through writing the entire book. Yeah, I try to have some, I like writing that has humor in it. And so I tried my best to put some humor into the stories, especially the ones that are like quite heavy. I like to try to maintain a bit of a balance, and if they make people laugh and freak out a bit, I think that's great.
Nice.
Thanks.
Okay, so our last question is going to be from Lily. Happy to hear your short stories. Do you utilize any special softwares like Scrivener or anything besides MS Word for the elaboration of your book?
No, just Word.
Just regular Word, old faithful.
Yeah, I'm very boring. I don't handwrite. I just type into word processing.
All right, good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know. Sometimes it's good to talk about the real logistical side of writing as well. Okay, so should there's one more question left. I think we're gonna have to leave it at that. I think we have time for one more question. I assume John will interrupt me if we don't. So this last question is from Rachel, who asks, did you write the queue more or less contemporaneously with the first wave? It really brought me back to the confusion as well as strange chaotic optimism of the time. I found it delightful and reminiscent of Waiting for Godot. The meaning of the pandemic never arrives. Thank you. Great question, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. Gosh, it's very hard to remember timelines, isn't it? Maybe if not like contemporaneously, like very close to that time. Maybe the toilet paper lines had like died out a little bit, but it was still, I think I might have written it like in that first summer. So yeah, within that period, it was still very like fresh in a lived in kind of way. Yes.
I love that idea of Rachel's, that the meaning of the pandemic never arrives. Still has not arrived.
Still has not.
Still waiting.
The line is still there.
Exactly. We're all sort of metaphorically in that line forever. So I just want to give the chance for either of you to offer any last closing remarks, last questions, final observations.
I just want to thank you both so much for doing this event with me. Like, you're both writers who I admire very much, and it's like a real delight to get to talk to both of you in this way. And Jenny, I hope that we can meet in person someday. That would be really nice. And yeah, Anna, I hope to see you in person as well.
Yeah, I hope to one day welcome you in person to this beautiful prairie background.
I would love to come to that prairie background. Yeah. And thank you so much to everybody for coming and zooming in, and to John and McNally for hosting this, and to Kay for doing the closed captioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much to McNally Robinson Booksellers, particularly John Taves, also to Helen's publisher, Metonymy Press, and the Winnipeg Public Library for co-presenting the event. And yes, Kay Pettigrew for your incredible live captioning. That was so great. And of course, yes, thank you both so much, Helen and Jenny, for being part of this discussion. It's been so fascinating, so nice to talk to both of you. And thank you all to the audience. Thank you all for being here, spending your Wednesday evening with us. You should definitely go out and buy both of these books, which are appearing mysterious and ghostly here. Here they are. There, yes, perfect. That's all I have to say. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you all so very much. Anna, you took care of so much of my gratitude, so I will just extend my extreme thanks to all the parties that were mentioned as well, Kay, Metonymy, and the Winnipeg Public Library. I am an inveterate bookseller, so I can't resist this opportunity just to remind everybody out there, if you're unfamiliar with the incredible books Metonymy publishes as well, not only is Personal Attention Roleplay such an exceptional collection, but their most recent publication by Eli Tariq El-Bashelani Lynch, The Good Arabs, is such an amazing book of poetry. And in early May, they'll be putting out a copy of one of the best books I read all last year, A Lot by Shola von Reinholz. So please pre-order that, read that book. You will not regret picking it up. It is amazing. Huge thanks to all of our co-presenters once again, and so many thanks to all of you here online today. Anna, for your incredible hosting, Jenny for joining us, Helen as well. Thank you everybody who came to attend this event. And just as a reminder to you all, this video will remain live on YouTube. So if you'd like to watch it again or share it with anyone who couldn't make it, please do. Thank you all so very much once again, and have a very lovely evening.